from the book Metaphysics. Look that up. From the book Metaphysics by Richard Taylor. Passage called Freedom and Determinism. Freedom. Freedom. To say that it is in a given instance up to me what I do is to say that I am in that instance free with respect to what I then do. Thus, I am sometimes free to move my finger this way and that, but not, certainly, to bend it backwards or into a knot. But what does this mean? It means, first, that there is no obstacle or impediment to my activity. Thus, there is sometimes no obstacle to my moving my finger this way and that. Though there are obvious obstacles to my moving it backward or into a knot. Those things, accordingly, that pose obstacles to my motions limit my freedom. If my hand were strapped in such a way as to permit only a leftward motion of my finger, I would not then be free to move it to the right. If it were encased in a tight cast that permitted no motion, I would not be free to move it at all. Freedom of motion, then, is limited by obstacles. Further, to say that it is, in a given instance, up to me what I do, means that nothing constrains or forces me to do one thing rather than another. Constraints are like obstacles, except that while the latter prevent, the former enforce. Thus, if my finger is being forcibly bent to the left by a machine, for instance, or by another person, or by any force that I cannot overcome, then I am not free to move it this way and that. I cannot, in fact, move it at all. I can only watch to see how it is moved, and perhaps vainly resist. Its motions are not up to me, or within my control, but in the control of some other thing or person. Obstacles and constraints, then, both obviously limit my freedom. To say that I am free to perform some action, thus, means at least that there is no obstacle in my doing it, and that nothing constrains me to do otherwise. Now, if we rest content with this observation, as many have, and construe free activity simply as activity that is unimpeded and constrained and unconstrained, there is evidently no inconsistency between affirming both the thesis of determinism and the claim that I am sometimes free. For to say that some action of mine is neither impeded nor constrained does not by itself imply that it is not causally determined. The absence of obstacles and constraints is a mere negative condition and does not by itself rule out the presence of positive causes. It might seem, then, that we can say of some of my actions that there are conditions antecedent to their performance, so that no other actions were possible, and also that these actions were unobstructed and unconstrained. And to say that would logically entail that such actions were both causally determined. Causally determined. Hmm. Let's try that again. And to say that would logically entail that such actions were both causally determined and free. Fuck. Fucked it all up, didn't I? Let's see here. Soft determinism. It is this kind of consideration that has led many philosophers to embrace what is sometimes called soft determinism. All versions of this theory have in common three claims, by means of which it is naively supposed a reconciliation is achieved between determinism and freedom. Freedom being, furthermore, a condition of moral responsibility, and the only condition that metaphysics seriously questions. It is supposed. It is supposed by the partisans of this view that determinism is perfectly compatible with such responsibility. This, no doubt, accounts for its great appeal and wide acceptance, even by some people of considerable learning. The three claims of soft determinism are: number one, that the thesis of determinism is true, and that accordingly all human behavior, voluntary or other, like the behavior of all other things, arises from antecedent conditions, given which no other behavior is possible. In short, that all human behavior is caused and determined. Number two, that voluntary behavior is nonetheless free to the extent that it is not externally constrained or impeded. And number three, that in the absence of such obstacles and constraints, the causes of voluntary behavior are certain states, events, or conditions within the agent himself, namely, his own actions of will or volitions, choices, decisions, desires, and so on. Thus, on this view, I am free, and therefore sometimes responsible for what I do, provided nothing prevents me from acting according to my own choice, desire, or volition, or constrains me to act otherwise. There may, to be sure, be other conditions for my responsibility, such as, for example, an understanding of the probable consequences of my behavior, and that sort of thing. But absence of constraint or impediment is at least one condition. And it is claimed it is a condition that is compatible with the supposition that my behavior is caused. For it is, by hypothesis, caused by my own inner choices, desires, and volitions. The refutation of this. The theory of soft determinism looks good at first, so good that it has for generations been solemnly taught from innumerable philosophical innumerable philosophical chairs and implanted in the minds of students as sound philosophy. But no great acumen is needed to discover that far from solving any problem, it only camouflages it. My free actions are those unimpeded and unconstrained motions that arise from my own inner desires, choices, and volitions. Let us grant this provisionally. But now, whence arise whence arise those inner states that determine what my body shall do? Are they within my control or not? Having made my choice or decision and acted upon it, could I have chosen otherwise or not? Here, the determinist, hoping to surrender nothing and yet to avoid the problem implied in the question, bids us not to ask it. The question itself, he announces, is without meaning. For to say that I could have done otherwise, he says, means only that I would have done otherwise if those inner states that determined my action had been different, if, that is, I had decided or chosen differently. To ask accordingly whether I could have chosen or decided differently is only to ask whether I decided to decide differently, or chosen to choose differently, or willed to will differently, I would have decided or chosen or willed differently. And this, of course, is unintelligible nonsense. Well, isn't that grand? Alright, let's see here. But it is not nonsense to ask whether the causes of my actions, my own inner choices, decisions, and desires, are themselves caused. And, of course, they are, if determinism is true. For on that thesis, everything is caused and determined. And if they are, then we cannot avoid concluding that, given the causal conditions, having trouble with that word, causal conditions of those inner states, I could not have decided, willed, chosen, or desired other than I, in fact, did. For this is a logical consequence of the very definition of determinism. Of course, we can still say that if the causes of those inner states, whatever they were, had been different, then their effects, those inner states themselves, would have been different. And that, in this hypothetical sense, I could have decided, chosen, willed, or desired differently, but that only pushes our problem back still another step. For we will then want to know whether the causes of those inner states were within my control, and so on in infinitum. We are, at each step, permitted to say, could have been otherwise, only in a provisional sense, provided that is, that something else had been different. But must then retract it and replace it with could not have been otherwise. As soon as we discover, as we must at each step, that whatever would have to have been different could not have been different. Examples. Such is the dialect of the problem. The easiest way to see the shadowy quality of soft determinism, however, is by means of examples. It's 8:30. All right, so examples. Let us suppose that my body is moving in various ways, that these motions are not externally constrained or impeded, and that they are all exactly in accordance with my own desires, choices, or acts of will, and whatnot. When I will that my arm should move in a certain way, I find it moving in that way, unobstructed and unconstrained. When I will to speak, my lips and tongue move, unobstructed and unconstrained, in a manner suitable to the formation of the words I choose to utter. Now, given that this is a correct description of my behavior, namely, that it consists of the unconstrained and unimpeded motions of my body in response to my own volitions, then it follows that my behavior is free, on the soft determinist definition of free. It follows further that I am responsible for that behavior, or at least that if I am not, it is not from any lack of freedom on my part. But if the fulfillment of these conditions render my behavior free, that is to say, if my behavior satisfies the conditions of free action set forth in the theory of soft determinism, then my behavior will be no less free if we assume further conditions that are perfectly consistent with those already satisfied. We suppose further, accordingly, that while my behavior is entirely in accordance with my own volitions and thus free in terms of the conception of freedom we are examining, my volitions themselves are caused. To make this graphic, we can suppose that an ingenious uh, physiologist can induce in me any volition he pleases, simply by pushing various buttons on an instrument to which, let us suppose, I am attached by numerous wires. All the volitions I have in the situation are accordingly precisely the ones he gives me. By pushing one button, he evokes in me a volition to raise my hand, and my hand, being unimpeded, rises in response to that volition. By pushing another, he induces the volition in me to kick, and my foot, being unimpeded, kicks in response to that volition. We can even suppose that the physiologist puts a rifle in my hands, aims it at some passerby, and then, by pushing the proper button, evokes in me the volition to squeeze my finger against the trigger, whereupon the passerby falls dead of a bullet wound. This is the description of a man who is acting in accordance with his inner volitions. A man whose body is unimpeded and unconstrained in its motions, these motions being the effects of those inner states, It is hardly the description of a free and responsible agent. It is the perfect description of a puppet. I'm not a puppet. You're a puppet. All right, we said it. Want to be joking or something? Trump. Oh, we said it. It's everywhere. Anyways, a puppet. Puppet. I'm not a puppet. You're a puppet. You're a puppet. To render someone your puppet, it is not necessarily forcibly to constrain the motions of his limbs after the fashion that real puppets are moved. A subtler but no less effective means of making a person your puppet would be to gain complete control of his inner states and ensuring, as the theory of soft determinism does ensure, that his body will move in accordance with them. The example is somewhat unusual, but it is no worse for that. It is perfectly intelligible, and it does not appear to refute the soft determinist conception of freedom. One might think that in such a case, the agent should not have allowed himself to be rigged in the first place. But this is irrelevant. We can suppose that he was not aware that he was was hence unaware of the source of those inner states that prompted his bodily motions. The example can, moreover, be modified in perfectly realistic ways so as to coincide with actual and familiar cases. One can, for instance, be given a compulsive desire for certain drugs simply by having them administered over a course of time. Suppose, then, that I do, and with neither my knowledge nor consent, thus become a victim of such a desire and act upon it. Do I freely, merely by virtue of the fact that I'm unimpeded in my quest for drugs? Okay. Let me try that again. One can, for instance, be given a compulsive desire for certain drugs simply by having them administered over a course of time. Suppose, then, that I do, with neither my knowledge nor consent, thus become a victim of such a desire, and act upon it. Do I act freely? Merely by virtue of the fact that I am unimpeded in my quest for drugs? In a sense, I do, surely, but I am hardly free with respect to whether or not I shall use drugs. I never chose to have the desire for them inflicted upon me. Nor does it, of course, matter whether the inner states that allegedly prompt all my free activity are evoked in me by another agent or by perfectly impersonal forces. Whether a desire that causes my body to behave in a certain way is inflicted upon me by another person, for instance, or derived from uh, hereditary factors, or indeed from anything at all, matters not the least. In any case, if it is in fact the cause of my bodily behavior, I cannot help but act in accordance with it. Whether it came from, whether from personal or impersonal origins, it was entirely caused or determined, and not within my control. Indeed, if determinism is true, as the theory of soft determinism holds it to be, all those inner states that cause my body to behave in whatever ways it behaves must arise from circumstances that existed before I was born. For the chain of causes and effects is infinite, and none could have been the least different given those that preceded. Simple indeterminism. What do we got here? Well, that's just about fate. Yeah, that's for next time, I suppose. Fatalism. Alright, well, there is no next time. Let me just tell you, real quick. Fate. Skipped ahead a little bit. We are all, at certain moments of pain, threat, or bereavement, apt to entertain the idea of fatalism. The thought that what is happening at a particular moment is unavoidable, that we are powerless to prevent it. Sometimes we find ourselves in circumstances not of our own making, in which our very being and destinies are so thoroughly anchored that the thought of fatalism can be quite overwhelming and sometimes consoling. One feels that whatever then happens, however good or ill, will be what those circumstances yield, and we are helpless. Soldiers, it is said, are sometimes possessed by such thoughts. Perhaps everyone would feel more inclined to them if they paused once in a while to think of how little they ever had to do with bringing themselves to whatever they have arrived in life, how much of their fortunes and desires were decided for them by sheer circumstance, and how the entire course of their lives is often set once and for all by the most trivial incidents, which they did not produce and could not even have foreseen. If we are free to work out our destinies at all, which is doubtful, we have a freedom that is at best exercised within exceedingly narrow paths. All the important things, when we are born, or what parents, into what culture, whether we are loved or rejected, whether we are male or female, our temperament, our intelligence or stupidity, indeed, everything that makes for the bulk of our happiness and misery. All these are decided for us by the most casual and indifferent circumstances, by sheer coincidences, chance encounters, and seemingly insignificant fortuities. One can see this in retrospect if he searches, but few search. The fate that has given us our very being has given us also our pride and conceit, and has thereby formed us so that, being human, we congratulate ourselves on our blessings, which we call our achievements, blame the world for our blunders, which we call our misfortunes, and scarcely give a thought to that impersonal fate that arbitrarily dispenses both. I want to thank y'all for tuning in to Billy Reed's books. Catch you on the flip flop. See you next week. Hope checked and trademarked that.